Welcome everyone to episode 4 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest.
So we have Bill Irwin on today, who's a philosophy professor at King's College in Pennsylvania. And so Bill Irwin is the author of Little Siddhartha, which is a book that I absolutely adore. And I mean, I have a lot of things to say and a lot of sort of comments on it, and obviously we're going to get into it. And he's also the author of The Simpsons and Philosophy, The Doe of Homer, and Seinfeld and Philosophy.
Yeah, so actually I watched your Google Talk actually online. I looked you up and I saw you discussing Simpsons and philosophy with a gentleman there. And it was very interesting to me. It was like my first introduction to you. I know that you're Leon's, one of Leon's favorite authors. He couldn't tell me enough about Little Siddhartha. And it's very interesting getting to know you. And
well, I'm honored to be on the podcast and really grateful to be speaking with you. I've been connected with Leon through Twitter for a good bit now, and I've enjoyed the exchanges and discussions with him. And it's great to see this podcast taking off for you. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. And so the first thing that I wanted to start with is, so the way that I actually met Bill on Twitter was through his book Little Siddhartha. So for those of you who know, so the book Siddhartha, the classic by Hermann Hesse, is one of my favorite books of all time. So a long time ago, I was kind of a Jungian in a sense, right? I absolutely loved Carl Jung, and so I discovered Siddhartha through the readings of Carl Jung, or through the writings of Carl Jung. Mm-hmm. And so I absolutely fell in love with the book, and it meant a great deal to me. And so when I discovered Bill Irwin's book, I was like just absolutely floored. I couldn't believe that somebody actually wrote a sequel to it, and especially someone obviously as notable as a writer as Dr. Irwin. So the biggest question that I have, Bill, is so what inspired you to write Little Siddhartha? How did you come about the idea?
Well, thanks, Leon. I'm not sure if I'm that notable of a writer, but Siddhartha is obviously a great book, and it's meant a lot to a lot of people like you and like me. I first read it in high school, and I think it's a book that speaks very well to young people, and I've found it continues to speak to me in different ways throughout different times in my life. But I teach an Eastern philosophy course at King's College. And I assigned the book as one of the first things that we read in the course, even though it's written by a Western author and it doesn't necessarily represent Buddhism and Hinduism in a completely faithful way. So I've read it and reread it many, many times over the past 20 years with my students. And a question about the book that's always lingered with me, and I've sometimes used as a discussion prompt with students, is what happens to Siddhartha's son? People who've read the book know that late in the story he's introduced to a son who he has, and he wants to keep the son with him, where he's living a sort of very Spartan ascetic existence as a kind of a hermit, and the son eventually has to leave, runs away, and I've always wondered, well, how would the story continue with the son? And so at some point I took the chance of trying to put down my own thoughts and together a story about what happens to the son and sort of intertwine it with the father's reaction and taking it from there. Yeah. Maybe just a question on the recording, if you guys don't mind. I hear an echo. I don't know if you guys hear that or if it's a problem in any way.
Oh, interesting. From our end, we don't hear it.
Should I have earphones in? Would that be the corrective, or?
If you want to give that a shot, you could. From our end, we don't hear anything. Is it really bad of an echo? Is it?
I don't hear it when you're speaking. I only hear it when I'm speaking.
Yeah, because we definitely don't hear an echo with you or from you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so long as it's only me hearing myself echo, yeah. I can easily adjust to that.
Okay.
I didn't know if it's a problem on your end.
Okay. I hate that whenever that happens on the phone, actually. You hear your own self, you're like,
Yeah.
I'll be like, oh, is this on speaker? Can you put it down or something? You know?
Yeah. But I think as far as the recording goes, that it will definitely be okay.
Is it manageable for you? Like, is it?
Yeah,
okay?
No, it definitely is. I just didn't know if it was manifesting on your side as well, and if it was a problem. That's all.
Okay. Okay. So
Okay.
and then so in terms of Siddhartha, what was it about the book that impacted you? What was it? What would you say were sort of the major existential lessons of it?
Right. So the book Hesse Siddhartha deals with the question of who are you and what is your true self, right? And it tells the story of a boy raised as a privileged Brahmin in ancient India, and he's learned all that he can from his father and the Brahmins, and doesn't really feel like they have the answers, right, about who he is and what his true self is. And so the story sees him set out on a search for his true self, and he joins and quits a group of samanas. He does not join and follow the Buddha himself, and eventually he lives a life of hedonic pleasure with a courtesan and working as a merchant before he eventually finds a spiritual path again. And that just really spoke to me as a young man in high school. I was raised Catholic, but I had lost my faith at a certain point in high school, and so I was really trying to figure out who I was and what my life was about if the answers that I had counted on in the past didn't speak to me anymore. And so I could really identify with the young man, and I didn't make quite the same mistakes that he made moving forward in my life from there, but I did make plenty of mistakes and indulgences and overindulgences in various places. So when I revisited the book, I don't know, 10, 15 years later, when I started teaching at King's College, I found that it wasn't just a book that spoke to me as a young man in high school. It spoke to me as a youngish man, probably in my late 20s. At that point, having seen where I had gone with my life and the changes I had gone through and what I had rejected and accepted and come back to, and the personal crises, conflicts that had involved, and in the past 20 years since, it's just been a very rich book to teach to students and to get their reactions to, and to continue to reflect on. Much of the story has to do with father and son relationships, and over the course of those years I became a father myself. My own father passed away, my son was born, my daughter was born, and so really the book Hesse Siddhartha has been just a touchstone for me, and I read and reread it continually.
Yeah. And what was so incredible to me about your book, about the follow-up to Siddhartha, Little Siddhartha, was the relationship between, obviously, the kind of new Siddhartha and his son Rahula. And so, for me, I mean, for some people who know, I kind of had a very similar relationship with my own stepfather. And so my own stepfather was actually highly narcissistic. And so it was such an important story for me in particular, because for Rahula, in a sense, I kind of identified with him when I was, let's say, from that sort of age, when I was kind of around, give or take, maybe around from 10 to 12. I mean, because my parents later on ended up getting divorced. And so for the longest time that I was sort of, I was considered to be a very sort of shy and sensitive kid. And so my stepfather was actually sort of kind of the definition of toxic masculinity. And so, yeah, so he never really accepted me as I was. And so for him, he persistently tried to change me. And for him, it was all about sort of attaining girls, attaining kind of accolades, kind of social status itself was the most important thing in life to him. And so for me, I was actually more in terms of kind of Rahul, I was more sort of leaning toward the spiritual side. And I had these deep existential questions about life. And for me, it never made any sense how he didn't care about them. So, and he would pretty much tell me that I was wasting my time with this. He's like, this doesn't matter. Like, these are answers that you'll never understand or that you'll never know. And you reading all of these books, right, you're essentially wasting your time, whereas you could be sort of studying business. So business was this huge thing for me. Absolutely. For him, it was all about the American dream, and not only kind of, not only making a good living for yourself, but sort of being your own boss. So,
which there's nothing wrong with.
Right.
In that sense.
Right.
But I hear you. He was really imposing that sort of reality on you.
Yes, and the point of sort of the story that really resonated with me was the fact that it was very difficult for Siddhartha to really sort of be compassionate to Rahula or understanding in any sort of particular way. And so, when I think about the book, I often sort of think about what it was like for me then. And even in the story, as Raula kind of actually really ran away, this was something that I wanted to do repetitively. There were so many moments where I just felt like I didn't belong in my particular family. And so I wanted to ask you, in terms of the sort of relationship between father and son in the context of Siddhartha and Raula, where did you come up with those ideas, especially for Siddhartha kind of being a highly narcissistic person and Raula, in sort of contrast, being this really sweet kid?
Right. So maybe I'll fill in the blanks a little bit for those who haven't read my sequel. Right. So Rahula is sort of the grandson of the original Siddhartha character. The original Siddhartha character in the titular novel Siddhartha by Hesse has a son who is named after him, and that's the little Siddhartha of my book. That son runs away from Siddhartha in Hesse's novel, and that's the son who I wonder what happened to him, right? His father is trying to force him into a spiritual life, and he's an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old boy being forced to live this lifestyle. So I imagine that what happens to him when he returns to the world is that he totally rejects the ways of his father and becomes a very materialistic, very merchant-oriented person, which is in some ways how Leon is describing his stepfather as being. And so what then happens, as I imagine in the story, is that little Siddhartha, the son of the original Siddhartha, has his own son, who he wants to raise in his own image as a very dominant merchant and alpha male, I suppose you might say. And the son, Rahula, just does not have that temperament and does not want to be that way. And as Leon suggests, eventually leaves home. And so just with that background in mind, I reflect on what it is like for fathers and sons to make sense of one another. Sometimes the father and son are quite alike, but no one is exactly like their father or has a son exactly like him. In my case, I had a much more fortunate upbringing than it sounds like Leon's circumstances were, although it really could have been different. It could have been pretty bad. My father also was a businessman, but fortunately for me, he didn't enjoy being a businessman. He really saw the grind and saw the pointlessness of a lot of it, and really the best advice and permission he gave to me was to find something that I love to do and do that for a living, right, whatever that might be. So I was really very liberated by that. But, there were other ways in which my father was quite different from me, right? My father was 6'2". On a good day with the right shoes, I might hit 5'8".
Same.
My father had been a great dresser, really could wear a 3-piece suit and look the part. And I always, liked grungy clothes before grunge was even a thing, that sort of thing, right? So I knew that there were ways in which I was not who my father wanted me to be or would have ideally thought I was. I mean, he was a terrific athlete. I was an okay athlete at best. And while he did his best not to express disappointment and those sorts of things, that's the sort of disappointment that always comes out sideways, whether you want it to or not. And my own son is now 15 years old. And, right from the beginning, there's the temptation to want your son to be like you, and in some ways to relive your life through your son, correct your own mistakes through your son. And so I've just been very mindful of that from the very beginning with my own son. And, with greater and lesser degrees of success. I'm sure he'll have his own memoir to write about it, or therapy sessions to fill with it as he gets older. I certainly haven't been, completely successful in that way. But that's been my striving, and I suppose it's been it took me a long time to want to write this book because it took me to the point where I really had my own son and could start to reflect back and see the ways in which my father had to struggle and bite his tongue with me and gently steer me certain ways and experience disappointment with me in certain ways. That really made me realize that I have to let my son be who he wants to be and do what he wants to do within reason, of course. But he just is not me and I am not him, and that's the way it's supposed to be.
I see. So do you find yourself resisting that urge to kind of steer him in a direction that you think would be helpful to him? Or do you still do that, but it sounds like you do it in a very mindful way, in the sense that like you're very aware of your behavior towards him, but you still do know a lot of these things that could be very helpful to him?
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it, doing it in a mindful way. I hope I do that. Like I said, I'm aware that no matter how hard I try, I nonetheless have a degree of failure with this. We all mess up our kids, no matter how well-intentioned we are and how generally successful we are. But I liken it to a classroom discussion where if it's going the way that I want, I'm steering without touching the wheel. I guess that's a driving metaphor put onto a classroom discussion framework that I'm now trying to import back to a parenting situation. So the metaphors have gotten terribly mixed, right? But obviously, I encourage him to do well in school, to be kind, to be compassionate, these sorts of things. Without directly mandating them in the way that can produce the backlash. To me, that's the interesting thing, right? That's the drama that I frame in the novel Little Siddhartha, is that when you try to push your son, and I'm sure it is true of children in general, right, as well with daughters. When you try to push your children a certain direction, it just can backfire on you. They may go along for a certain part of the ride, but then they tend to rebel and go in the opposite direction. So it's kind of a bit of reverse psychology, as they might say, by not pushing too hard in any particular direction. I mean, I've seen this in some cases with friends and people I know who've insisted that children be devoted to a particular sport, and that they go along with that for a certain number of years because they have an aptitude for it and it pleases their parents, but then eventually they become resentful of it, and what's left of the relationship and how much hurt there is after the child rebels. I guess maybe I've tried to smooth a road that is the path of least resistance, in the sense of not insisting so hard on something. And so then if what I want to or desire in my head or think is good, I can more readily deal with the rejection. I don't know.
So is it about so that, for example, in this, I don't want to get too personal, but let's say in the case of your son, you want his decisions to be his own, but still, if they could align with these higher ideas, that would be good. But to push them would kind of maybe cause him to rebel, let's say, because it's not his own idea. Maybe for some time he'd go with it, but then ultimately it has to be like as if he chose this path himself.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. So one area where that has been an issue that I'm comfortable talking about is with regard to religion. I'm not religious myself. I consider myself to be kind of an honest atheist. So it's questioning, and like any believer has moments of doubt. I have some moments of doubt in my atheism. My wife is Christian and goes to church, and the children were raised going to church with her. That wasn't something that I was particularly happy about, but I didn't fight it all that hard, so long as we could have open dialogue about it at home, etc. And so that's been interesting. my son at this point has ceased going to church, which is what I wanted all along. Right? So my daughter is 13, and she still does go to church, and that's fine. We had an interesting moment with her just recently where she's been confirmed, and she had to write a belief statement for that, and she wrote a belief statement for which she was roundly praised at her church, and the belief statement basically said, I don't know what I believe, which I think is great. And it turned out that a lot of people in her church did as well. The only mystery to me is how they managed to go ahead and confirm someone who said that they didn't know what they believed, but I guess that's up to them, and that's in some ways praiseworthy that they would be willing to put their stamp of approval on that. So yeah, I mean, like when it comes to something like religion, I would like my children to come to the conclusion that they don't believe in any God or subscribe to any organized religion. But I think probably the worst way for me to get them to do that would be to insist that they not believe in God or subscribe to any organized religion. But who knows? If they come to sincere belief and sincere faith, that's fine with me as well.
And so just to return to Little Siddhartha, I really wanted to focus on what to me was sort of the crux of the book, and I would say undoubtedly the most profound aspect of it. And this was something that I spoke to Bill about personally, that in terms of my own relationship with my father, it was the part of the book that essentially helped me the most. And this is sort of in the context of, I would say maybe even several years of therapy, that I felt that this sort of notion and this kind of the dynamic between them in the book was even more important to me in a way, in terms of kind of in connection to even the therapy sessions that I've had. And so the quote from the book exactly, or kind of specifically, is to understand all is to forgive all. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, and what did that mean to you, kind of, let's say personally, but then also in the context of the relationship with Siddhartha and Rahula?
I wish I could take credit for that quote, but it's not mine originally. It's kind of a saying, I suppose, and I think it originates in the French, and I won't even try to pronounce the French because my little bit of French is so bad. But basically, right, to comprehend all is to forgive all. And to me, and that fits with again, not even being religious myself, a prayer that I like quite a bit, the prayer of Saint Francis Assisi, which has the powerful line about seeking first to understand and then to be understood. And so understanding all and then forgiving all, basically in this context, means that people have motives and hurts and struggles all their own that we don't see, right? We're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides, and when we do this with somebody who, when forgiveness seems most warranted is when the person, right, has hurt us, has harmed us. And all we can usually see when somebody's hurt or harmed us is that they are feeling good and they are in a position of power, and here we are in a position of weakness and in a position of having been harmed. And it's forgiveness is sort of an easy thing to preach when it's directed at people who really haven't hurt us that much, or who aren't in a position of power over us, or even more so, people who express some regret, some sorrow, some remorse for having done some harm to us. The real challenge for forgiveness and for compassion, as far as I can see, is for the person who's actually in a position of power over us, or at least was at some time in the past, and doesn't express any remorse or sorrow for the hurt, the harm that they've caused us. But the idea then that I see in this idea of to understand all is to forgive all, is that if we could realize the struggle, the fight that's going on inside the person who's been our tormentor or the cause of our harm, we could forgive it. And of course, that person might not want us to go to them and express the words of forgiveness. After all, they haven't likely expressed any sense of having done wrong or having done harm themselves. But there's a way, I think, of making peace with those who've harmed us, even when they haven't actually expressed that sorrow or regret that we might wish they had.
Yeah, and I thought that that's such an important part of the story was, the context that you get of Siddhartha's life. Because, obviously Rahula was definitely the most sympathetic character of the story, but you also understood what Siddhartha went through and sort of being abandoned in a way by his own father, only to discover that his father, obviously like him, wanted him to sort of fit a particular mold too. Right.
That's it, right? The irony generationally in the story that I tell, right, is that the grandson turns out to be just the way that the grandfather, yes, the original Siddhartha, would have wanted, right? Yeah. So skipped a generation in a way, and this happens, right? We're not always a great match temperamentally for our own sons or our own fathers, and so I'm not sure what more to say there.
Yeah, and I thought one of the most important aspects of it was the two roles, right? The roles of Kamala and the roles of Rahula's mother. It seems like the both of them were essentially the backbones of their families, especially when these sort of two other men, these two Siddharthas, were fairly hard-headed. And so I kind of wanted to know, what did you think of them and sort of in the context of their own sort of upbringing, and how in a way they helped them feel accepted, and obviously and kind of they maintained their sanity. They were, I would say, in a way, the sole providers for their children, or definitely the main providers for their children.
Yeah, that in a way that's a sort of corrective that I wanted to make from the original. Not that I should really try to touch Hesse's original, but the mother, Siddhartha's own mother, is really not mentioned except in passing in the original. We do get some reflection on how his own father must have been hurt by his leaving, right? And this is something that only dawns on the original Siddhartha near the very end of the novel, where he sees his own face reflected in the river, and he's come to physically resemble his father when he had left home, and he realizes that having not gone home after all these years, the hurt that he caused his father, well, what about his mother, right? And so I tried to make a stronger mother figure in the sequel that I wrote. But I think you're right. The mother, the wife, turns out to be really the backbone. In the original Siddhartha story, Kamala plays an important role, but one of the it works perfectly well in the story. But one of the unfortunate things when you simply speak about the story in the abstract, anyway, is that Kamala is a courtesan, and so. I don't want to say necessarily that there's an element of misogyny there, but there certainly is a tinge to her character that maybe considering she's the only prominent female character in the original novel, that we want to show something else in addition as the story continues.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are sort of some of the main existential lessons of Little Siddhartha? Some of the sort of universal truths that people can take away when reading it?
Well, I hesitate to prescribe, but in terms of the questions, right, it continues the questioning that the original novel raises about who are you, right? What is your true self, and how do you go about discovering that, right? And I suppose rather than prescribing a single answer to it, like the original, my sequel, Little Siddhartha, highlights the value of the quest itself, and not simply accepting the answers that are given to you from family, from culture, from religion, right? This is the problem in a way in the original, and it's a problem in the sequel, as I tell it as well, right? Because we had Little Siddhartha grown and becoming a successful merchant, finding who he wants to be, and it really fits with his temperament and his ego to be a merchant, a successful merchant, and he thinks that's really the answer to life's problem and who someone should be, but it turns out not to be the right prescription, the right life for his son, although he tries to force it on. So I suppose the message, rather than an answer that I hope the book delivers, is that the answer to the question of who you are is only to be found in your own search, and that may call for breaking away from your family, your culture, your religion, or it may not, right? It may be, and this certainly does happen, that you find the right answers for you within your own, whatever it may be, culture, religion, family.
Bill, would you say that the search for who you truly are involves, let's say, ego death, like a process of dying? This is really, well, sorry, it's related to your article that I read. And I read in there, dying to who you were, to constantly, like, to die, and then you then reconstitute yourself and become something else entirely. And it's like this process of always kind of not becoming this rigid, stable structure, but you're always in this kind of becoming phase. And it is interesting to me that the reason why it resonates to me is because it has to do with that whole process of ego death. And I was wondering, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Alen. So you're referring to a blog piece that I did on Psychology Today, which is partly a book review of John Kagg's book, Hiking with Nietzsche. And Kagg is great. I'd recommend him for a guest on your podcast for sure.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
So part of what Kagg muses on in his book Hiking with Nietzsche is the sort of oracular phrase that Nietzsche takes from the Greek poet Pindar, "Become who you are," which it sounds like the sort of puzzling nonsense that would have driven Leon's father up a wall, right? Become who you are. What the hell is that, right? Either you are who you are or you're not, and you can't become who you are. What sense does that make, right? But the way in which Kagg puzzles it through with Nietzsche, in a way, has to do with ego death, as you put it, right? That we have to be willing to change to the point where we're not what we were, and yet it's still faithful to what we want to be. I'm probably not giving it the best phrasing there, but Kagg himself in his own book, and this is the reason I ended up blogging about it, references Hesse, and in particular the novel Siddhartha. And one of the things I always liked about Hesse's novel is that it has these metaphorical reincarnations within it, right? It's set in a Hindu and Buddhist context. Both religions, of course, subscribe to reincarnation, but we don't get literal death and rebirth so much in Hesse's novel, so much as we get a metaphorical death where Siddhartha dies to his childhood as a Brahmin and becomes a wandering ascetic samana, dies to that and becomes a worldly merchant, dies to that and becomes a sort of hermit. Again, in each place, he becomes something very new, but he also brings with him the value of what he learned before, right? And so this is very important, right? We sometimes give ourselves credit for change, where the change really isn't anything substantial, right? In my life, I referenced some of this very obliquely before. I've been through some radical changes. The ways in which my life has mirrored Siddhartha's in some ways is that I did have my own period of great excessive indulgence. And about 22 years ago, I got sober. I've been sober ever since, and that to me has been a major change. For me, becoming a parent was a major change. These were not just kind of little changes where I'm very much the same as what I am, but now I'm playing a new role as well. In order to really meet those new selves, I had to carry what was worthwhile from the past forward into becoming something new. And so that's sort of what is referenced by this becoming who you are that CAG deals with in discussing Nietzsche, and that I grapple with a little bit in that blog.
You know, I've been wondering about this for a while. The concept of ego death, of dying to who you once were, or even in terms of let's say people are taking on newer challenges, and let's say they're kind of it's something new they've never done before. We were talking about this last week actually, overcoming self-imposed barriers to success, and how people kind of go through this resistance when taking on a new task, and even if they objectively know it's good for them, they might feel these feelings of discomfort while undertaking it, and then that may cause them not to try to undertake that task. But then what's interesting about this concept of ego death, rather what's interesting about it is that if this was something that was, I mean, it is pretty mainstream. I mean, I know about it from, let's say, going online and stuff, but I would say, I guess my question is, what do you think maybe we could do, either from your end, or maybe what we could do since we're podcasting, to kind of make this concept of ego death and becoming more of a mainstream thing? Because that's really my passion, which is trying to get a lot of these topics, which I feel are very important for people to understand, but make it digestible to the masses. Because I notice it's all about kind of like delivery is so important, how you word things is so important, and then how someone from an audience perspective, how they resonate with what you say. So I don't know. What do you think? Yeah.
It's really tricky, right? And it's particularly tricky for most of us, given our cultural background. From a Buddhist perspective, right, which is so much of the orientation that Hesse's character is growing into, there is no self, right? And this is one of the sort of more esoteric subjects that I grapple with a little bit in the novel, right? If from a strictly Buddhist perspective there is no self, then what does it mean to set out to try to discover the true self? There was none to begin with, in a way. If we understand what we mean by the self as something about us that's permanent and identical across time, well, when we look within, we really are hard-pressed to find what that is, right? We're afraid of change to a large degree, right? Change is scary. It disrupts stability. It disrupts security. Nonetheless, most of us, if not all of us, want to change in various ways, become something more, something different. And so I think we're at a disadvantage in many places in our starting place. So in a way that's not all that helpful to say that our starting place is a disadvantage, except to say that we have to be compassionate toward ourselves in realizing that. And I think one of the lines I've adopted for myself about getting myself to do something difficult that I'm looking at is a line from a friend of mine who was a Marine. I guess this is a common phrase in the military, but he always says, "Embrace the suck."
Yeah.
Right? You know that one, right? Where what looks like it will suck and maybe will suck, if you throw yourself into it, you actually can find that you enjoy it, right? Psych yourself up, right, to go out for a run in the rain, even though that looks like it will suck. You know, convince yourself that you will enjoy that somehow, and you throw yourself into it. And I think back about summers between years in college. I worked in a sort of, not a factory setting, but it was basically truck loading. And you would get used to one particular task, whatever it was. And I should speak for myself. I'd get used to one particular task, whatever it was, and feel like I'm finally doing this at a level that doesn't make me look like an idiot here, right? That I seem somewhat competent, and I definitely don't want to do that other thing that I see those guys doing. And then I'd be made to switch to do that, right? And I would be totally uncomfortable. But then I'd find that the challenge of learning to do it somehow competently was enjoyable, and then I wouldn't want to move on to whatever the next thing was. So I mean, that's sort of something that I think many people can identify with in workplace scenarios, where you become comfortable in doing one particular kind of thing and don't want to do something else, but then you find you enjoy the novelty of the new thing all the more when you get to doing it. I think the other thing, and this is maybe getting closer to what practical advice you were searching for, and it may not be any kind of a silver bullet, but one thing I find is that people don't like to be labeled, and rightly so, right? None of us is whatever it may be, simply a father, a teacher, a therapist, a mother, a daughter, an American. We that may be a role that we play, and those actually may even be not the best examples, because many of those are things people take pride in wearing the label of. But we don't want to be reduced, for example, to a political label or to a religious label. And when it becomes more negative, right? Like, for example, when I find myself labeling somebody in my own mind, that guy's a jerk, or sometimes, the description is a lot more colorful than that. I try to correct it and say that guy's acting like a jerk right now, right? But he's not really a jerk, right? And so when I think about things about myself, right, like I'm carrying about 15 pounds that I shouldn't be carrying right now, optimally. I could label myself as fat or lazy or whatever like that, right? But that's not particularly helpful with motivating myself, right? Because in a way that just gives me permission to simply slack back into that. Well, what is a fat guy but a fat guy? What is a lazy guy but a lazy guy, right? How can I do anything differently, right? But when I realize that I'm none of those things, right? Then I realize that I have not only the freedom but the responsibility to make those kind of changes, and this is something that comes up as well in the article that Alen was referencing, and it's an existentialist insight, which I know is right up Leon's alley, right? Jean-Paul Sartre talks about the way in which no one really is a thing, right? And the labels that we put on ourselves and get put on ourselves really are constricting, and they're not true. And so Sartre's, one of his famous examples is the person who is a waiter. Anybody who has waited tables probably can identify with not really wanting to be a waiter and be looked at and treated as simply a waiter and nothing but a waiter, right? People want to be treated with courtesy and respect when they are waiting tables. They're not simply a waiter to be summoned as a thing like an elevator might be summoned. Nor is it helpful. It may help us to get through the day or get through the shift if we're a waiter, to simply think of ourselves as, I'm just a waiter, and playing that role. But in no role and with no label that's put upon us are we ever actually that thing. And if it's a negative role, right, that we're either putting upon ourselves or that others are putting upon us, not only do we have the freedom, but we really have the responsibility to reject it and to move beyond it and to create ourselves as something new. And I guess this is some of what I'm taking from this idea of become who you are, is that it's not a finished process. It never is, right? We're all always works in progress. We're always, in that sense, becoming who we are. And leaving behind something of the past that doesn't work and carrying forward what does work, and hopefully forming a new synthesis.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because we just recently did a show on labeling. Well, at least partially speaking.
Yeah, part of last week's show.
Yeah, and so we focused on Albert Ellis and REBT therapy and his sort of disdain of all labels, whether positive or negative. And so for Ellis, he just said essentially that it never made sense to label yourself as anything, whether, let's say, you were beautiful, intelligent, anything even positive. Because for him, essentially, it's like if you're this particularly good thing, that means you have to be this good thing, generally speaking, and globally, in every single context. So for Albert Ellis, he said, okay, look, we already know the difficulties of the negative labels, but the thing is with the positive labels, what that tends to cause is because they're so context dependent and so sort of time dependent, is that you have to be that thing in every single context, and if you aren't, that essentially leads to depression, that leads to anxiety, and philosophically speaking, no label can actually be defended. Because if, let's say, you're hypothetically speaking even a waiter, you have to always be a waiter. That has to be an inherent part of who you are, and it isn't, right? Or at least, and it certainly doesn't have to be. And for the most part, there are very few people that actually stick with a particular label, even for the majority of their lives. And so for Ellis, this idea was that essentially that just very Buddhist, and Albert Ellis was essentially influenced by the existentialist especially, and even Buddhist thinking, where he said, in terms of the labels, in terms of who we are as people, the reason why they don't make sense is because we're always changing and we're always growing, and even as importantly, we're always adapting to our sort of environment. And so when it comes to sort of labels and it comes to kind of being defined by a particular thing, it's very easy to get bogged down in it, and it's very easy to tell yourself, well, if I'm this particular thing, then I guess that's all I can be ever, right? And I can tell you, obviously, even kind of in my therapy sessions, that that's never the case. I see people sort of grow and progress and become whatever it is most of the time that they want to be, obviously within the sort of context of, like, as Sartre would have called it, existential freedom. And so it's so interesting how these concepts are all sort of linked together and how we all touch on very similar ideas here.
And the way I simplify it, even though it's not necessary to simplify it, but just for fun, just as simple as I am precedes I am this or that. There you go. Honestly, you don't need to really, I mean, you want to elaborate, you do want to break it down, but say somebody just wanted to make it simple for themselves, like, okay, I'm not this label, I'm not that label, I just am. If you want to refer to Eastern philosophy, let's say, you could say, okay, I am. You don't have to get spiritual about it. If you like, you can. If it's fine. Let's just use the practical parts of this. Like, I am just consciousness. I'm just aware. I'm just just attention, and then anything else extra is perhaps something you might be identifying with and making into who you are, which that could lead to a lot of good things, but also a lot of bad things, kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, and what we touched on last week was this idea that essentially the labels in themselves aren't altogether a bad thing, but labeling what? So if you're labeling yourself and your whole sort of being, then that's negative, and philosophically, again, indefensible. But when we're talking about labeling thoughts, feelings, and actions in terms of how conducive they are or aren't to our success, then that's a wonderful thing. So if you were to say something like, let's say this action was a failure or this action resulted in failure, I would say absolutely, it absolutely did, right? So let's sort of go back to the drawing board and figure out what we could do differently. But are you a failure? I mean, if the answer is yes, you would definitely have a hard time proving it, because globally speaking, I would ask, how in the world can you be a failure all the time, everywhere? How could you have never ever achieved any sort of form of success? And obviously that's impossible. So...
Yeah, no, this is great, and you really highlight well what I've thought for a long time, the way in which all these different streams of the intellectual tradition come together, right? The Buddhist, the existentialist, the Stoic, and so much of this manifested in in psychology, right? Albert Ellis and cognitive behavioral therapy, and all for the good.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, and lastly, before I think we have about maybe 9 minutes left. So, I also wanted to ask you about your new book about sort of questioning God. And so, it seemed really interesting. Would you be okay with telling our audience a little bit about it?
Oh yeah, thanks for asking. So I had, in passing before, mentioned describing myself as an honest atheist, by which I really mean somebody who questions his or her atheism, doesn't take it as a settled fact. And the title of the book is God is a Question, Not an Answer: Finding Common Ground in Our Uncertainty. It actually grew out of a New York Times opinion piece that I had written. People could find that free on the internet through the New York Times if they'd like to read it. It's the same title, God is a Question, Not an Answer. And I was just basically making the case that as someone who's an honest believer, recognizes that faith and doubt go hand in hand, right? That it really isn't even faith if there is no doubt that goes along with it. So too, on the other end of the spectrum, the honest atheist needs to say that it's possible that I could be wrong, no matter how much I think I have eliminated certain likelihoods and possibilities. There's always the possibility that I could be mistaken about things. And so I conceive of belief as along a continuum of certainty, where we can never really justifiably arrive at 100% certainty for or against when it comes to the issue of God. And so that's the gist of the book. And I think hopefully it's a call for cooling temperatures and tempers, and finding common dialogue across religious disagreement or atheistic disagreement.
Yeah.
Is it out now, or is it?
It is.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'm picking it up.
and it's so interesting because, I mean, interestingly enough, I think academically speaking that, although let's say, and I am an atheist as well, but I think that a lot of us sort of view it and we're presented in such a way as to let people know that we understand that it's likely, that, or rather that it's unlikely that, let's say, a being that we call God exists. And so, Bill, have you ever read by any chance John Mackey's The Miracle of Theism, Arguments for and Against the Existence of God?
I've not read it, no.
Oh, so it's a wonderful book. So John Mackey was this wonderful philosophy professor at Oxford, and so he wrote this book essentially outlining the arguments, the sort of mainstream academically speaking, kind of the most notable arguments for God, obviously in kind of the philosophical tradition, and all of the arguments against God. And so in the end of the book, because Mackey is obviously he's an atheist, so he essentially presents this sort of mega argument against the existence of God. But he sort of carefully notes that it's not that this disproves the existence of God, but what it shows that if we put all of the arguments and the major philosophical arguments against God together, that it makes it highly unlikely that there is a God. And so I thought that Mackey just in that book handled the topic masterfully. And so obviously it's a bit different when we kind of talk about mainstream atheism and maybe even like people like Richard Dawkins. So I did a little bit more sort of fundamental and militant, but interestingly, the God delusion is actually based on Mackey's The Miracle of Theism. But Mackey doesn't go so far as to say that we know 100% that God doesn't exist, but he says that it's very, very, very unlikely based on the facts and the sort of science and everything that we do particularly know in that kind of context.
Right. That sounds much closer to where I come down on this. And actually, the reason that I wrote the book, I didn't have plans to write this book at all, but I had written the opinion piece, and I got berated and stormed with negative commentary. And to my surprise, it wasn't coming from the Bible Belt telling me I was going to hell. It was coming mostly from militant atheists telling me all kinds of things about how I didn't know what I was talking about. And of course, in a short opinion piece, I didn't have every base covered or every term defined, etc. So in a way, all of the negative comments became my way of responding. They gave me the opportunity to respond and put together a short book. But this topic, and I was reminded of this, Leon, as you were speaking, dovetails into our discussion of labels, right? I choose to label myself as an honest atheist, but with the fluidity in mind that I could someday be back in the realm of what I might consider instead agnostic, or actually even a religious believer. And some of the negative comments that I received were telling me you're not an atheist at all, you're simply an agnostic. And well, I mean, it depends on how you define the terms, right? And I don't believe that I'm an atheist or an honest atheist in the way that a chair is a chair, right? This was sort of Sartre's point, that we're not things. It's just simply a convenient label to describe where my thought is at the moment. And I recognize I may shift on this in any possible number of ways in the future. So relax a little bit. And when it comes in particular to religion and politics and things like this, a label doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be any kind of thing or stay stable with views and positions for the rest of your life. And it doesn't mean that you should demand anybody else does either, but allow it to be simply a placeholder, an indicator that's fluid and up for change.
Right, and if one were to be intellectually honest, I would say that that's the only sort of way to perceive things and the only way to kind of behave toward the world. Because, I mean, in terms of science, that is what science is supposed to be. And I remember the famous debate on evolution between Ken Ham and Bill Nye. And so both of them were posed the same question. And they said, what would make you change your perspective? Ken Ham said nothing, and Bill Nye said evidence. Right? And that's exactly as it's supposed to be. So technically speaking, we're essentially kind of going through the world and we think we know what we know. And there's a high likelihood that what we know is absolutely true. Like, especially when it comes to the Big Bang, when it comes to evolution, and even when it comes to the existence of God. So we know that it's very highly likely that, let's say, the first two things are true and the latter isn't. But the thing is that, yeah, I mean, that's sort of how life is. And in terms of intellectual honesty, if we were to be presented with counter evidence, if we were to be honest and if we were to be actual sort of academics, or let's say honest in terms of our search for truth, then yeah, we would have to accept it whichever way it goes.
Yeah,
and it's important to highlight every single perspective and point of view on the matter. Take a look at every single position and then kind of integrate as best as you can from all those positions what is true or not true. And evidence is very important. You can't, I mean, I understand, I can be sympathetic to somebody who is religious and, for instance, has a deep relationship or inner world where they feel this connection. That's completely fine. I respect that. Please, do as you will. The problem with a lot of religious beliefs is when there are people who will take it to another level where they'll actually either impose it on other people, right, or act also in violent ways as well. That happens. And also could just be easily just kind of would just not want to be around people who are not religious. Right. And kind of it kind of separates us more than unifies us. Yeah. So,
And just obviously, because we're kind of already pretty much out of time, just to wrap things up, Bill, is there anything else that you wanted our audience to know?
No, well, I'm always glad to hear from people who have listened to the podcast or have read something that I've written, whether it be Little Siddhartha. And a couple of the nice things that I've heard about Little Siddhartha, and I don't know if they're true, but certainly if anybody is reading and has this reaction or another, positive or negative, but the two of the more gratifying comments that I've gotten is that some people have said that the voice of Siddhartha of Hesse seems captured in the sequel, that they could at least for moments forget that they were reading something written by Bill Irwin and think that it was actually a lost sequel by Hesse.
Yeah, I had that experience too, by the way. It felt like it's such a smooth transition. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Without meaning to fish for compliments, I do appreciate that. And then I'll tell you one thing I didn't think about the book itself, but some people have told me they had the other experiences. that I thought of it simply as a sequel, and that it wouldn't really make sense unless you had read the original. But some people have told me that they've read it without having read the original. And really, I tell you, read the original. And if you have to read one or the other, read the original. But if somehow you foolishly read my book and haven't read the original, you may find that it actually still makes sense and still can be read somewhat profitably. So I don't know. But I guess in closing, I'm just always glad to hear from anybody. You can catch me on Twitter or Facebook, or find my email address and my website very easily by just Googling William Irwin, Irwin. And always appreciate a good conversation and hearing from people with different points of view.
And I definitely ask all of my audience members, if for people for you guys who love literature, who love sort of existential philosophy and just any sort of deep thought, to please pick up Little Siddhartha. I think that you guys would absolutely love this book, because in all honesty, and I don't say this with any sort of exaggeration, it literally changed my life.
Mm-hmm. And get the new book. The Pearl, I am picking it up right after this.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Bill.
It's been a pleasure.
All right.
Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for watching.